Well, it's a beautiful day out here today, and I'm looking at pretty much full blue sky. And today I thought I'd take a few minutes and talk about one of the more common trees around these parts, the Douglas fir, and I'm pointing my camera at several of them here. There's also a pine tree in the mix, which you may or may not be able to tell the difference. The pine tree that's in here has much thicker furrows in the bark than the Douglas firs do, and a slightly lighter color to the bark. But I'll show you the differences a little closer up here too. Here's a Douglas fir, kind of a young Douglas fir. I guess it's a couple of years old probably. And you can see that the needles on it are quite short, and they're just scattered about, one needle coming off the stem at a time, as opposed to a pine, which I have a branch here that I picked up. The pine has very long needles, and the needles are actually clustered together in what are called fascicles. They're joined at the base. This particular one has 3 needles per fascicle, and each species of pine has a different number of needles per fascicle. Well, actually some have the same, but that's one of the characteristics that distinguishes the species. Now, the Douglas fir is kind of a confusing tree name-wise. It's called the Douglas fir. It's a common name, but its scientific name is actually 𝘗𝘴𝘦𝘶𝘥𝘮𝘨𝘢. Okay, so that's kind of weird because the species epithet there, 𝘗𝘴𝘦𝘶𝘥𝘰𝘵𝘴𝘫, means it should be Menzies, not Douglas. But historically, it used to have the name, went by the name 𝘮𝘴𝘦𝘯𝘻𝘪𝘪. But because botany, the rules of naming are that the first name that was published is the correct one, and somebody had forgotten about the published name 𝘮𝘴𝘦𝘶𝘥𝘮𝘨𝘢, and it was found out later, and so the name reverted back to that older name. So today we know it as 𝘮𝘴𝘦𝘶𝘥𝘮𝘨𝘢, but foresters still call it the Douglas fir. The genus name is also rather odd because 𝘮𝘴𝘦𝘶𝘥𝘴, that's the genus, literally means false 𝘮𝘴, and 𝘮𝘴 is hemlock. So the Douglas fir is actually a false hemlock, not a fir. The genus that has all the firs in it is Abies. So a rather confusing tree on that count as well. So from a confusing name that we now still call Douglas fir, even though it's not really a fir, I want to show you the cones too. And the cones have an interesting story. Here's a pine cone for comparison. I'm going to show you that first. Pine cone's rather large with very large cone scales, and that's typical of pine cones. Whereas a Douglas fir cone, which I'll pick up right here, is much smaller overall, and it has quite different cone scales. And I'm going to get really close up here to this. There's some very broad dark brown cone scales here, and then there's some lighter colored ones that, if you look closely, resemble little squirrels with 2 feet sticking out and a tail. And First Nations, some First Nation tribes in the Pacific Northwest actually have a legend about that. There was a tribe that angered Raven, and to get away from Raven and to hide from him, they went into the fir cones. And Raven discovered where they were hiding, and he turned them into squirrels. And so they're known as the Squirrel Tribe to this day, and they're still stuck in those cones. So the next time you take a walk, take a good look around, and you'll notice the real tall Douglas fir trees, and you'll probably see in many areas that you'll find a few pines. Here's a pine tree just for comparison. Notice the bark there, quite a bit lighter colored, and then if you look up the tree, you can see the long needles on the branches as opposed to the rather short needles for the Douglas fir. So 𝘮𝘴𝘦𝘶𝘥𝘴𝘪𝘪 should be the Menzies fir, but remains to this day the Douglas fir. So I hope you enjoy your next walk as you look for a few of those trees out here, and for the cones so you can see the squirrels.